So one thing that comes up quite often when people are looking at an electric bike, something out of the ordinary, right? Electric bikes are a little bit heavier, cargo bikes are a little bit heavier, sometimes the motors and the wheel. What do you do when you get a flat? That question comes up a lot, and really I wanted to make this video to discuss that. And we're going to cover it, through several different sections. We'll start with just basically the overview of what do we generally tell people when those sort of things might come up. So the first question I get a lot is, what should I do when I get a flat? I'm going to address this in kind of a couple different ways. Really, to start, it's just what I would generally tell somebody. It partly depends on where you are. If you're at home, there might be a different scenario than if you're out and about. And if you're in a city, it might vary. In New York City, for example, there happens to be a lot of bike shops all over the place. These days, the service departments can be quite busy, so that's kind of a challenge to consider. But generally speaking, that's one of the comforts of living in a city, to have all these different bike shops available that you could potentially bring your bike to, have them handle your flat tire for you. But I think it's good to, maybe be able to do that stuff on your own, but not everybody's comfortable with that, and you don't necessarily need to do that. So first, I just say the different ways you could potentially handle it. One is to potentially bring it to a shop. You might be wondering, how can I get it to the shop if the shop's not nearby? There's a couple different things. One, if the shop is maybe in walking distance or something like that, you might want to walk the bike. At least the bikes that we sell, they have something called walk assist, and that will help you to walk the bike along. The one important note is, don't ride the bike. If you have a flat tire and you ride the bike with a flat tire, you can really severely damage the rim or the wheel overall, probably the wheel overall. You might be in for just actually replacing the whole wheel or rebuilding the wheel, and that's something you don't want to get into. So I would say if you walk it, you should be okay, provided there's not too much weight in it. If you have a cargo bike that's loaded up, or you have stuff in your panniers and stuff like that, you want to be mindful of that. You could potentially contact a mobile service or something like that. These are not so common, but they're becoming more and more common, so there might be a scenario that exists in the future. You could call a friend. Maybe that's something to even consider ahead of time. Hey, if I'm out on a ride, do I have my one call that I could potentially make to have somebody come by? If you need to bring it to a shop or something like that and it's not nearby, you might be wondering, what do I do? Maybe you don't have a friend that can pick you up or whatever. Actually, in New York, quite commonly, what people end up doing is they call a car service like Uber or something like that. If you have a big bike, you might need to use a Uber XL. I know that stuff can be kind of inconvenient. It's good to plan ahead. That's really the bottom line. Think ahead of time. You need help, figuring that out. Maybe you could put a comment and we could think of some other ideas if you have this unique scenario. But I hope that we can address most of them today. So the second question is, how do I change the flat myself? And what tools do I need? This is really going to vary depending. Some people can get away with fixing a flat with practically no tools. And it really depends on your bike. Some bikes have quick releases on the wheel, so you can remove the wheel without any special tools. And you could generally see that when they have a little lever on the side. And there's all different variations of this, but it usually makes it a little easier to pull the wheel off. One thing you'll probably hear consistently is plan ahead. So get familiar with your bike. Understand how to, remove these parts, because it's helpful to understand that. And outside of a quick release, one of the most common tools to actually remove a wheel is a 15 millimeter wrench. This is a very common size for solid axles. Now, a lot of electric bikes do have these quick releases, or some of them do have these solid axles, and they're generally found on bikes that have internally geared hubs. So we sell a lot of bikes with the Enviolo hub or the roll-off hub. The roll-off hub uses a quick release for the most part, but a Shimano internal hub, a lot of times they have a 15 millimeter nut on there. So having that is helpful. And then there's some other scenarios, again, with through axles that it might actually use a tool. Oftentimes that's going to be a 4, 5, or 6 millimeter Allen key, or it can be even something even different beyond that. But again, if you get familiar with that, it's a matter of figuring out which tool do I specifically need to remove the wheel. Once you remove the wheel, some people are comfortable actually removing the tire without any special tools, but generally it's recommended, and it's oftentimes very helpful to use what's called a tire lever. A tire lever just kind of gives you some leverage to be able to remove that tire. Now, I will note that a lot of times with these bikes with the wider tires, they can be a little bit tough to get off the first time. If your bike does have these like wider tires with the wider rim, oftentimes that tire is kind of stretched on there. In the center of the rim, there's generally a little bit of a groove, which means that it's a smaller diameter. So if you can actually get what's called the bead of the tire into that groove, it's going to create kind of a smaller diameter and give you more room to remove one side of the tire. So you're going to want to at least remove one side of the tire bead from the rim, and this allows you access to that tube. Now, there's a bunch of different ways you can repair a flat from this point, which is adding a patch, but we generally recommend replacing the tube. I mean, different people have different opinions on this, but for some of the trouble you might go through to remove the wheel and everything else, it's oftentimes just better just to not worry about it, put a new tube in there, and go from there. So outside of those tools, you're also going to need a pump or a CO2 inflator or something like that. A lot of times people like to carry like a CO2 inflator because it's really small and compact and lightweight, so you can kind of pack all these things into a very small bag and carry with you, so you have your like flat fit fix kit. So outside of those tools, you're also probably going to need something just to address like elevating the bike or some way to prop the bike up so that you can actually remove the wheel. Now, it's going to vary if you're taking the front wheel out or the rear wheel out. It's going to change if you have a cargo bike or some sort of, a particularly heavy bike. Some people will say, like with the lightweight bike and you don't have any special components on it or something like that, you just flip it upside down and it's no problem. Now, on electric bikes, that's a little bit challenging because you have a display and oftentimes you have many controls on the bike. So if you flip it out upside down, you might end up damaging those things. I did actually find a product. Now, we don't sell this product, but it's some sort of like prop thing for the handlebars, and it's actually just like little tripods for the handlebars. This guy's actually in Southern California, and I was looking at his website recently, and I think that's a cool product, and we'll link to that in the description below because I think it's something worth considering and could be something that works well. But there's other ways to do it as well. Now, if you have a stand and you're at home, like a traditional bike stand, I mean, this is what we use in a shop, obviously, but you might not have that at home. You can use that, so actually like put the bike up in a stand and address it that way. That's probably the best way to do it, but that's not always so practical for people. There's other ways to do it with just kind of no real special tools. Actually, you can use a rope. You might be wondering, what am I going to do with that? So you can take the rope and actually tie it to, if you're in your home, if you have like a rafter or something overhead that can support it, make sure you're mindful of how much weight this thing can support. That's a good way. Like if you're in a garage, a lot of times there might be something above you that you can tie it to, and then you can actually tie the bike to that to elevate it. It could be really helpful. And a lot of times you only need to actually elevate one side of the bike. So it'll be a little bit more stable if, say, you're working on the rear wheel, you put the front wheel on the ground, and you just tie that rope to like the seat post or something like that just to elevate that rear wheel so you can work on it. Now, if you're not at home or you don't have something like that in your garage, you can do the same thing with a tree branch. Okay, so I recommended to try this, rope with the tree sort of thing, and I didn't want to like leave that in the video without knowing for myself that it works. My friend Doug recommended it. He said he used it all the time, but this is mostly with like racing bikes. I'm sure it's a little bit different with electric bikes, so I had Tara and Asia actually try doing this, and they struggled a little bit, so I figured let me just see if I can figure it out with my special army skills or something like that. But let's see what we can do. There's two different ways to really do this. Probably the easiest way is just to find a spot that you can just prop the saddle on. I'm basically just going to take the bike and just prop the saddle here, and I think that works pretty well. Like, this is relatively solid. I guess if you wanted to like take this extra safety measure, you could probably like strap this on here, but I would be comfortable just using it like this. I feel like it's on here pretty well. The weight of it's holding it pretty well. Actually, in some ways, like having a slightly heavier bike set up like this maybe will keep it more secure. So we'll try the rope technique here. And in theory, you only really need to prop up the rear of the bike. You don't necessarily need to prop the whole bike up. But basically what I would do is just put this up here. I think this is what you guys were like struggling with a little bit. It kind of flops around a little bit. You don't try to go up too high. Like, I mean, really, this is probably plenty. So at this point, you could probably, I think that the knots is really, it's all about right here. So, I mean, really, that's all you need, like a couple inches off the ground. And you could also do different things, like do a derailleur adjustment, different things like that. But at this point, it's off the ground enough that you could pull the wheel off. So, okay, so I guess it works. I mean, talking with the girls, it seems like part of the challenge is maybe just like not balancing it correctly on the frame, figuring out like the right point there. I don't know, did you guys take physics? Was that the missing course here that really changed everything? I used some Army skills there. Maybe that's what it was. Join the Army. You'll learn how to put bikes up in a tree with a rope. It's not really a rope, it's a strap, but have fun. Now, if you have a cargo bike, you might have a double kickstand on there. That double kickstand is really helpful for loading kids on and off the bike, but it's actually really helpful for changing a flat as well, because it actually will elevate the bike or the wheel or that sort of thing. So sometimes it really depends on how the bike is balanced. Sometimes you have the bike up on the kickstand and the front wheel just seems naturally elevated. That's going to be really easy to fix that flat. Now, if it's naturally elevated and it's kind of balanced that the rear is going down a bit, you could do a couple different things. One, you could probably put a little bit of weight in the front of the bike to elevate the back if that's the wheel that you need to address. Or you can just put something small to prop up the rear end of the bike, or vice versa if the bike is set up differently. Like this is more like a front loader scenario. If it's a rear loader, it might be a bit different in that way. So those bikes can be very heavy and it might be difficult to use this rope technique, but you know, it still could work considering you're only lifting part of the bike. You're not lifting the whole thing. But I think that's mostly it on the tool side of things. There's other tools out there as well, but I think that's mostly what you might need. And, you know, you can always practice this. You don't necessarily need to have a flat to, you know, remove the wheel and see if, hey, can I take the tube out and put it back in? One of the main things that you'll learn here is just to get familiar with their bike, consider these ideas, and, you know, you can see where you can go from there. And the third question is, how do I prevent getting a flat? We've kind of thought about this a lot, and there's kind of a whole industry thinking about this thing because there's a lot of different products on the market. There's a lot of improvements to tires and all sorts of things, and I want to just kind of discuss a little bit of them. So the first thing we're going to talk about is just preventative measures you can take on your existing system without adding any special hardware or anything like that to actually prevent flat. And the first thing is tire pressure. Really important detail. I find that a lot of times people get flat tires because their tire pressure is too low. They might get what's called a pinch flat, and that means that your tire, you know, normally it's kind of shaped like this. When it's really low, it can kind of flatten out, and it doesn't have the protection against the rim. And what ends up happening is you run over something, it's got a sharp edge to it, and it pinches the tire against the rim, and you end up getting a hole in the tire. Now, also having a low tire pressure, or PSI, pounds per square inch, you can end up with a scenario where you have a much larger surface area on the ground and you're a lot more susceptible to pick up debris. Now, this might be particularly an issue in certain areas. Say you're in an urban area and there might be a lot of debris on the ground. I should also note when it rains, what ends up happening, a lot of times roads, they kind of are like shaped like this and the debris kind of go to the edges and you don't usually encounter them. But actually when it rains, it kind of ends up washing all the stuff into the center. The water can actually make these debris stick to the tire a little bit easier. So whether it's glass or metal or something like that, so it ends up getting stuck to the tire. And it might not be the first time you roll over it that it gets stuck in there, and it might be over time it kind of gets pushed in there and it gets pushed in a little bit more, and then eventually it actually punctures the tube. So I mean, it can go, you know, for a long time talking about a lot of the theories on how you actually get a flat, but Having that tire pressure inflated properly, if the higher the pressure, the less likely you are actually to get a flat. The lower the pressure, again, like I said, having a larger contact area on the ground, you're going to improve your traction, but you might be a little bit more susceptible to getting a flat. So pretty much all tires are going to have a recommended PSI on the side of them, or it can also be noted in bar, which is more commonly used in Europe, and that's basically how the tire pressure relates to the external pressure in the air. But we usually just use PSI, and my general recommendation is a little bit below the top rating. If you go really low, when you're more susceptible to a flat, but you also might be more susceptible to damaging your wheel or your rim. The ride might be a little bit more comfortable, might not be as controllable. How do I actually tell if my tire pressure is too low? I mean, certainly you can use a tire pressure gauge, but another thing, you're probably going to feel it. You can definitely see it. If you look at the tire, you're going to see that you actually don't have that much separation between the tire or between the rim and the ground, particularly when you're sitting on it. You might not notice this when you're not sitting on the bike. The bike only has the weight of the bike on its own, but actually when you sit on it, you might see that it goes down. I was thinking about other ways to test this without a gauge, and we were just kind of experimenting with some different things, like actually trying to bounce the tire. And I think actually if the tire is very well inflated, it's going to bounce more than if it's not inflated. So maybe you might actually want to even take a baseline with your tire. I don't know. The kind of crazy ideas I get in my head sometimes, but you can test it. And if it bounces a bunch, you're probably in good shape. But if it doesn't bounce much, you're probably in not so good shape. But some people can just feel it too. You could just feel the tire. Does it feel firm? That's a good indicator. So, because that PSI, the tire pressure, is going to be a really big deal. For the tire pressure, you're also going to want to check it regularly. Some people might be wondering because, a car tire, you might not check it that regularly. Maybe you check it, every couple months. Maybe you check it once a year. But actually, a bike tire, you might want to check it every couple rides. Some people check it every ride. And that might sound a bit weird, but especially when the tire has very high pressure and you might have a scenario that the tube is lower quality. I mean, some of the better quality tubes are going to hold the air a little bit better, but some of the lower quality ones, if there's any imperfections in the rubber, that air is going to leak out a little bit over time. So continually adding air is an important detail. And so one other thing, without actually changing, the tires, the tubes, or any other sort of things on the bike to improve your flat prevention, I'd recommend just inspecting the tire regularly, especially if you live in an urban environment. Now, what we find, especially in our New York City shop, is a lot of times people come in and their tire might have little pieces of glass or metal in there, and you want to remove these things because, as I said before, they might sit there and they might not puncture that tube right away, but over time they might get driven further and further into the tube and ultimately actually cause a flat. And with that inspection, you want to also just make sure that you have enough tread left on the tire. Oftentimes the tire starts getting worn down, and then as the tire gets worn down, you have less protection for that tube. So you start out and you might have a couple of millimeters, but if you end up with just 1 or 2 millimeters, then you could think if all it's going to take is a very small piece of glass or something like that, or a thorn would be no problem to puncture through that. That gets to the next thing, some of the things that you can perhaps add to the bike or swap out on the bike to just decrease your chances of getting a flat. Now, a lot of the bikes that we offer generally come with tires that have some sort of flat prevention measures already there. And what that generally means is that contact patch that's going to go on the ground is a little bit thicker. So a normal tire without any sort of special flat prevention might be only a couple millimeters, sometimes only 2 or 3. But oftentimes these tires with this additional rubber or this flat prevention, they're going to be additional 3 millimeters, 4 millimeters, sometimes even more. We generally work with a company called Schwabe, and I know that in German it's pronounced a little bit differently, but I'm not going to get into that discussion today. But most of the companies have this sort of thing, and this is a new and growing trend as bike commuting becomes ever more popular. A lot of the tires are starting to implement more of this flat prevention. But there's other things you can do as well. Now, we've been working quite a bit with this company lately called Tannus. They make these things called Tannus tire liners, and what it is really thick foam. This is, I think it's like 15 millimeters in the center. You go from a couple millimeters of flat prevention with the normal tire, and then you add this 15 millimeters, and suddenly it's nearly impossible for anything to penetrate from, it will go through the tire, and it might even get into the Tannus tire liner, but for it to go all the way through that and into the tube, it's going to be pretty challenging. So those things work really well, and if somebody's really concerned about getting a flat, we usually recommend installing those on their tires, especially if they opt for perhaps a more performance-oriented tire that might not have as much flat prevention. Now, that's kind of a whole nother topic, but I will note that most performance-oriented tires, their big focus is being lightweight and being, really fast, which, generally is associated with being lightweight. And they're going to have less puncture protection. That's just the bottom line. So it's important to be mindful about that when you're choosing your tires. So there's just a couple more things that you could possibly consider in, changing out on your bike to make it more flat resistant. And one of the things that some people do, it's more common with mountain bikes, but some people do this with urban bikes, is going tubeless. And the idea is actually you remove the tube from your tire, similar to a car tire, you just run the tire with no tube. Now, if you have a very thin tire, if you do that, again, what we were talking about before, if glass goes through it or something like that, it would be even easier to puncture than if it didn't have a tube. So what you want to do is add some sort of sealant. And the idea is if something punctures through the tire, actually the sealant kind of pushes through it and it naturally seals itself. And this measure works really well, but the challenge with it can tend to take a bit more maintenance. And a lot of times people don't really want to fuss with it. In this scenario, it's even more important that you're taking your tire pressure measurement regularly. You're really keeping an eye on that, because if it gets too low, you may end up in a scenario that sealant starts leaking out, and then you have to reseat it, and it's really a big job. And so our general recommendation, if you're concerned about punctures and you don't really want to fuss with all this extra maintenance, is add a tire liner. The one other thing that many people do is add like slime to their tire. The challenge with this is it makes the wheel a lot heavier, and it can also change the ride characteristics and the performance, because you don't have the real suppleness that you have with the normal tire. That's part of what we really like about these Tannus tire liners, because they're foam and they can kind of react to the imperfections in the ground, so you're not in a scenario where you just feel like you're riding on a solid tire. Those things exist too, but I pretty much never recommend them because they can be quite dangerous if they were to fail. And because a failure with those, what it looks like is the how tire and tube can actually dislodge itself from the rim, and that can create a very dangerous situation, as you could probably imagine. Now, I think there's a lot of improvements going on in that particular side of things, but I don't think it's fully there, and it's not something that I'd recommend at this current time. I think that's all I wanted to cover on this flat prevention topic. If there's other things that you want to have covered on this, or really any topic in general, just leave them in the comments below, and we'll do our best to help. We're trying to put together some more resources on these sort of things, so you can look out for that in the future, and I look forward to seeing you in a future video. All right, well, see you soon.